All right. Thank you for joining my YouTube channel today. It's been a while since I've shared some of my research. Um, if you've been following along, I am deeply fascinated by really all the events that surround the events of the Apollo missions. And something that's intriguing to me is that considering the momentous nature of the Apollo missions, there's actually very little generative art from that time period, or I should say, it generated very little art from that time period. What we're going to look at today is one such piece that came as a response to the Apollo missions, and we're going to be looking at W.H. Auden's Moon Landing. This is a poem that he wrote in the months following Apollo 11. And to begin, my co-host today, Jordan, and I are going to do a brief recitation of the poem. I'll begin on slide 2. It's natural the boys should whoop it up for so huge a phallic triumph, an adventure it would not have occurred to women to think worthwhile, made possible only
Because we like huddling in games and knowing the exact time. Yes, our sex may in fairness hurrah the deed, although the motives that primed it were somewhat less than menschlich.
a grand gesture. But what does it period? What does it os? We were always adroiter with objects than lives, and more facile at courage than kindness. From the moment,
The first flint was flaked. This landing was merely a matter of time. But ourselves, like atoms, still don't fit us exactly. Modern only in this, our lack of decorum.
Homer's heroes were certainly no braver than our trio, but more fortunate. Hector was excused the insult of having his valor covered by television.
Worth going to see? I can well believe it. Worth seeing? Nah. I once rode through a desert and was not charmed. Give me a watered, lively garden, remote from blatherers.
About the new, the Von Brauns and their ilk, where on August mornings I can count the morning glories, where to die has a meaning, and no engine can shift my perspective.
Unsmudged, thank God, my moon still queens the heavens. As she ebbs and fulls, a presence to glop at. Her old man, made of grit, not protein, still visits my Austrian several.
With his old detachment and the old warnings still have power to scare me. Hybris comes to an ugly finish. Irreverence is a greater oath than superstition.
Our apparatniks will continue making the usual squalid mess called history. All we can pray for is that artists, chefs, and saints may still appear to blithe it.
All right. So that is the poem in its totality. I think before I share my thoughts on the analysis, I'd like to hear what Jordan has to say, given that she is relatively new to it. And I imagine most of our audiences as well.
Sure. I'm definitely excited to go deeper into it because there's a lot of language in here that is not language you or I commonly use today. A lot of throwbacks. So that will be fun to dig into and really understand what exactly he's saying. I can't say the word apparatchiks comes up in my day-to-day conversations. Um, I
Well,
mean,
about that particular word, it's
yes.
actually not a real word. It is
Oh,
a neologism that he has created.
oh.
I will share my thoughts about what I think that word actually means.
Can you define neo? How did you say that word?
It's a new word, neologism, new and
Neologism.
yeah,
Okay, that's a cool
neologism. Yeah,
concept. That's a cool
yeah.
concept. Um, I mean, just to be direct, there's obviously very, very explicit phallic sexual imagery like throughout the poem. Anytime we're talking about the moon and the sun, we have like the feminine and the masculine archetypes super present. So I think that I mean, it's so direct here. Often we read poems and it's a little bit more uh dressed up. But he just like gets right to it. So that's very interesting as well. And I really did like this concept of bringing in the idea of history. We're talking about the moon landing, which for us is a huge piece of myth. And I think where history and myth, the demarcation line between them, I think is an interesting question. What are we talking about here?
Yep.
And how do they function in our culture?
Yep.
And then, of course, there's like this open question of what does Auden really mean here? How much are we projecting our own perspectives onto it or not? But it's art, so I think it's a valid thing to do either way. But those are my initial thoughts, Luke.
I think
Unless
it's
you have
okay.
any other questions.
I think it's okay for us to project our own conceptions about what's going on here onto poetry. We're just talking. We're just talking about art. It's not that serious. I know
Yeah.
everybody is so obsessed with whatever, disinfo or whatever. I think what's really interesting um, about I encourage people to do more poetry analysis. It's not something that I was really trained in or something that I did throughout my life, but I view it as like a form of code breaking. And that's what makes it really exciting to me. And what's so interesting is like, there's always this element of plausible deniability that Auden would be like, oh no, I didn't mean that. But I think if you really were to go through it and scrutinize what's going on between the lines and the word choices, et cetera, I think you kind of get the take of what Auden was trying to communicate. But there's so many obscure references in poetry, and this one in general, that who's going to take the time after hearing a recitation to go through it and be like, what do these antiquated words even mean? What does this made up word apparatniks mean? Like, I think most people just kind of go along their business. And as far as I know, I don't think anyone has really broken this poem down. This is considered to be part of Auden's later period, and generally is sort of written off as him being a grumpy old man, and that the poem is really not that exceptional. I don't know enough about Auden to say for certain, like what he, um, uh, like what he, like where this fits in his whole um, anthology. So
Hmm.
yeah, if we could share the presentation
Yeah.
again.
At the beginning.
Mhm.
Okay.
So we're back to it, and let's do a close analysis. So first, I'm just going to talk about this photo. Uh, I have obviously provided some editorial content here that I believe is relevant. These images are not necessarily are not associated necessarily with what Auden is talking about, but they may be in the ballpark when we get to certain points. So this image, I believe, for the 50th anniversary of the moon landing in DC, they projected the Saturn V rocket onto the Washington Monument, and this is such a strange, obviously ritualistic performance, if you ask me. Um, and we're coming up on the anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon landing. It happened on July 16th, 1969. Today is July 11th, 2024. So I believe we're coming up on the 55th anniversary, if I have my math right. So it's natural the boys should whip it up for so huge a phallic triumph. I think the first thing we have to ask ourselves, why would Auden capitalize boys? Who are the boys? Is Auden bringing our attention to the patriarchy writ large? Or does he have another institution in mind? And the boys is a euphemism for it. I'm not going to go into that too deeply, but I think it's worth considering. And as far as the phallic triumph, this seems to be a pretty obvious allusion to Freud's psychoanalysis. And I went to Wiki just to refresh our understanding. And Wiki wrote, Verticality and great height have ever been the spatial expression of potentiality, I'm sorry, of potentially violent power. Sigmund Freud metaphorically drew a comparison between high achievement and the acquisition of wealth as building monuments to our penises. I think this is pretty undeniable if you know the occult background of the Washington Monument and the projection of the Saturn V rocket onto it. I don't think it's too much of a stretch. And going to what Jordan said earlier about the masculine and feminine principles that are involved in the moon landing, I wanted to share this relevant piece of information that I got from the Sacramento ScottishRite.org. The phallus was among the Egyptians, the symbol of fecundity, expressed by the male generative principle. It was communicated from the rites of Osiris to the religious festivals of Greece. Among the Asiatics, the same emblem, under the name of Miriam, was in connection with the female principle, worshipped as the symbols of the great father and mother, or producing causes of the human race after their destruction by the deluge. On this subject, Captain Wilford, Asiatic Researches, remarks that it was believed in India that at the general deluge, everything was involved in the common destruction except the male and female principles, or organs of generation, which were destined to produce a new race and to repeople the earth when the waters have subsided from its surface. The female principle, symbolized by the moon, assumed the form of a lunette or crescent, while the male principle, symbolized by the sun, assuming the form of the lingam, placed himself erect in the center of the lunette, like the mast of a ship. The two principles in this united form floated on the surface of the waters during the period of their prevalence on the earth, and thus became the progenitors of a new race of men. Here then was the first outline of the point within a circle, representing the principle of fecundity, and doubtless the symbol connected with a different history, that namely of Osiris, was transmitted by the Indian philosophers to Egypt and to the other nations who derived, as is elsewhere shown, all the rites from the East. So if this is the case, we can possibly see why a solar deity, such as Apollo, would become associated with the phallic Saturn rocket on a mission to the feminine moon. It appears there is a sexual allegory going on here that is either synchronous, implying that there is no conspiracy, that this was foreordained from all time, or intentional. And that has always perplexed me because I couldn't understand, it made no sense to me why you would name a moon mission after the sun god. But if you see it properly through the sex allegory, I think things start to fall into place. What say you, Jordan?
It reminds me of a conversation where you brought up kind of the craters of the moon and the rockets. I mean, we're getting very graphic and explicit here, but just the subject matter is. And my mind also goes to, are they trying to create something? You know, these archetypes of the masculine and the feminine are really the catalyst within this realm for creation and creating new life. So I don't know if that is an intentional purpose of this ritual, or as you said, just a synchronous subliminal expression of the subconscious. Something we probably can't validate or invalidate, but I wonder about.
Right. I mean, it did say from the Sacramento Scottish Rite website that after the deluge, all that was left were that male and female principle to repopulate the earth with a new race of men. And I think this is something that catches my attention a lot because it seems like there's an effort to transmute, to practice some sort of alchemy upon the human race in general, and to create a new type of being. So whether or not these are working through the forces, the archons that are outside of our perception, or this is something that is being done intentional in back rooms, I think is up for debate. I don't want to get too far into that today, but I think it's worth contemplating. What did you think about this line, "It would not have occurred to women to think worthwhile, made possible"? It's going to go on to talk about men, but
Mhm.
Did, being a woman, how did that resonate?
It's just something in general I've been thinking about. Um, Not unrelated to the movie The Box and the differences. I mean, that's like a whole different side tangent, but kind of the differences in the way that men interacted with this phenomena versus women. I think in general, when I think about feminine energy, and by the way, we all contain both of them. And so I don't think anything I'm saying is about all women only do this all of the time or anything like that. But when we're talking about the basic fundamental energies behind these concepts, the feminine energy is more about receptivity and more about like kind of accessing creation within. I mean, we contain physically the womb. So there's less of this, I think, instinctual drive to create by penetrating the world. That's how I took it. Um,
Mm.
I'm personally not offended or anything like that. When I really think about these energies and also having worked more with developing and stepping into greater spiritual maturity with my masculine energy as well, like to operate on the earth plane and be successful, you really do need to master both. But as a woman, like I know through personal experience and meditation and some of my own encounters with the mystical realm, like that womb energy is very different, and to be successful with it is more about being open. Whereas when I'm trying to create something through a more of a masculine channel, it's more about like going out, projecting outwards. They're different. But this is all very subjective and, to use the word numinous, very experiential, and not something I think that I have like a logical breakdown to share with somebody.
Well, that's super interesting. We're talking about this in regards to the Apollo missions, but as many people already know, Apollo had a twin, Artemis,
Yes.
who is now the mythological figurehead of our current moon landing effort. And I think it's very astute for you to pick up on this. This aspect of male energy, which is very penetrative and trying to conquer, et cetera, and what the female energy is more receptive. Um, they're having trouble with the Artemis missions that they didn't have trouble with the Apollo missions. Like they keep getting delayed and pushed back. It seems like it's been on the drawing board forever and ever, ever. Not that there weren't setbacks with the Apollo missions. In fact, Auden, I believe, was born on February 21st, which was the slated date of Apollo 1 um, to launch. But as I think anyone who's familiar with the Apollo missions knows, that the Apollo 1 mission was incinerated on the launch pad on January 27th, which is Lewis Carroll's birthday, which is relevant to all of this. But uh, yeah, there seems to be more of a struggle to make sure that the Artemis project hits its deadlines. And I wonder if that's emblematic of these. It's the wrong energy. It's the wrong type of thing. I'm not
Mm.
trying to be sexist or anything, but I'm just responding to what you're being sensitive to.
Yeah, it also makes me think of, with the moon in general, there already is, I think, access to this energy within womanhood that I see expressed amongst my community and my own experiences. Many people call the menstrual cycle their moon cycle because it follows a similar pattern. Um, there's many songs about the moon and the secrets of the moon, but they're all very feminine secrets, and they're not secrets you get through force. They're really secrets you get through a curious listening and opening. Um, but yeah, maybe there's less of this drive to go out when one develops this ability to just tap into that archetypal energy within.
Yeah, that's big. I'm looking at the clock, and I know
I
we have
know we
probably
gotta go.
ten more slides. So let's move on to the next one. I mean, I feel like we could talk an hour about this slide, but okay.
Sure.
All right. So this the image for this slide, this is Kennedy giving his famous moon speech at Rice University. I find that super interesting that Rice is mascot are the owls. So the fact that his moon speech occurred at a place known for the owl, symbolically, I find that intriguing. It reads, because we like huddling in gangs and knowing the exact time, yes, our sex may, in fairness, hurrah the deed, although the motives that primed it were somewhat less than Minchlik. So primarily what I'm concerned with here is the meaning of Minchlik. I didn't know what that meant. It's Yiddish for human or humane. Um, it's interesting, why did Auden choose to use Yiddish in this poem about an American effort? I think we could get into that at some point. But I think the main thing we want to ask ourselves is, why was this less than humane? And I had this to say, I suppose that Auden is pointing out that the space race was driven more by a desire for arms race superiority over Russia than for knowledge. He likely is pointing to the disingenuous pitch of the moon landing. If you survey the reasons for why we supposedly went there, it's because it's there, because we do hard things. It's like this very nebulous sort of pitch, and really doesn't, I think, hold up under scrutiny. And then if you get to a deeper layer, it's really about the Cold War and Sputnik and da da da. It wasn't all this like all these poetic expressions of why we have to do this thing. And then I think if you go to a deeper layer, you kind of see the whole Cold War explanation as being completely garbage. But we're not going to talk. We're not going to get into that. I'm trying not to go into those places. So I think that's what he's trying to say there. Was there anything else that jumped out to you about this?
I think the only thing I'd add is that, and you sort of outline this, but it's interesting to see Auden comment on potentially layers of conscious and subconscious reasons that men go out and conquer.
Mm-hmm. Right. Because we like huddling in gangs and knowing the exact time.
You got your watch.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's an interesting question. Why do we like knowing the exact time? What is the male fascination with numbers? I started this whole thing off like it happened on July 16th, 1969, and it was 55 years ago, coming up in a few days, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And even like, I could start breaking down the gematria of it all. Why were there, 17, well, I don't know if why were there the number of missions that there were? Why was Apollo 11 the one that landed? Men tend to hyperfixate on these things. It might be built into the masculine archetype as well.
Yeah, I think that's a whole nother conversation.
Yep.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. All right, let's get to the next slide. So the image that I chose for this stanza of the poem is that of the Pythia in the Apollonian temple in Greece. This was the oracle that politicians consulted in order to make their decisions about the city-state. There's always explanations. The Pythia is a fairly well documented phenomenon that the educated people of the time took very seriously. I think from our modern perspective, this sounds so strange that we'd be consulting a priestess of Apollo to know what we were doing in the forthcoming year or season. I think modern classicists understand the Pythia to be someone who was inhaling these fumes from the cave that she was in and giving these prognostications, and that all these individuals were somehow tricked into listening to the prophetess. but clearly it worked for a very long time as far as how they organized their culture. And I think we really have to ask ourselves, have things changed? Are we still consulting uh, uh, prophetesses and oracles? And is there anything to that? But the stanza reads, a grand gesture, but what does it period? What does it os? We were always adroiter with objects than lives, and more facile at courage than kindness from the moment. So generally, Auden is complaining about the meaninglessness of the event. Period and os typically refer to meaning. It can also sometimes refer to a prognostication, like what does it mean? What does it foreshadow? That's what I think he's trying to say here. And he ultimately sees it as being a meaningless endeavor. You went to the moon. It was a dusty desert. You played some golf. You rode a moon buggy. Wow, that sounds amazing. Why did we spend? That's where the billions went. You know, we did the bunny hop on the moon. You guys invented Tang. Thank you for the Tang. Is this all we got? And I think Auden is sensitive to the nihilistic aspect and how this really introduced nihilism into the modern state of mind. But we'll get to that in a little bit. In this line, we were always adroiter with objects than lives. Auden seems to be pointing out how we are squandering our intellect on inanimate objects rather than improving our fellow human beings. Like, we could have spent that money in such a way to elevate the human condition, and we clearly have not. And taking a look at word choice here, facile I knew from taking Spanish in high school. It generally means, it has two different meanings. In regards to a theory or argument, appearing neat and comprehensive only by ignoring the true complexities of an issue, so to make it superficial. Or it's something that's easily achieved, like it's kind of an empty victory, a facile victory. So that gave me pause, and I asked myself, taking both definitions of facile, Auden could be saying that courage could come more easily for us because we have a simplistic approach to the realities of existence. You know, it's easy for us to be courageous and try to plant a flag on the moon and think that this is advancing mankind through one small step or one giant leap, but we don't really understand what the human psyche needs. What say you, Jordan?
That I have much more to add. I am interested in this contrast of courage and kindness, and what does kindness mean in general is a concept that I'm interested in. But yeah, I don't have much more to add on the critique of, what was it for? And I think, to me, that indicates it's not really for practical purposes. None of this was done for any type of tangible success, is how it seems to me. It seems more like an expression, or it's like an inner fulfillment, right? Like, this conquering doesn't have any real need. And I think it's interesting to think about, where does man go? Where does this masculine energy go when the primary problems of existence are solved? Do we continue to just like create new ones? And like, how far can we go externally before finally like going back internal? And I don't know, maybe that's just like not the nature of the masculine energy. But at some point, it seems like there will be nowhere to go but within.
Well, I think also, I mean, if we really grasp what is happening here, I think it has something to do with the alchemical magnum opus, so the great work. But
Yeah,
I'm not sure Auden is sensitive to that just yet. And
sure.
that's a thesis I'm developing via my study of Jung. Let's see. Let's go to slide 5. The first flint was flaked. This landing was merely a matter of time, but ourselves, like Adam, still don't fit us exactly. Modern only in this, our lack of decorum. So for this slide, I chose the image of Moonwatcher, the ape that gets the gnosis from the monolith at the beginning of 2001: Space Odyssey, and Thus Spake Zarathustra plays, and his mind awakens and he realizes that he can use the bone weapon to commit murder and ultimately consume his rivals, so that his brain can grow. And that this is all, we see with the bone jump cut scene, one of the most famous scenes in all cinema, that bone, that initial weapon, that initial application of technological savvy is transformed into the orbiting nuclear satellite that we see in the shortly after the Dawn of Man scene in 2001. And this is quite interesting, for it implies that the moment mankind entered a new stage of consciousness, specifically the manipulation of matter, that our journey to the stars was inevitable. And this raises interesting questions concerning predestination. How much of humanity's future was baked into that first technologically conscious act? So, yeah, I find that, the moment we ate of the apple and had the knowledge or touched the monolith or whatever creation myth you want to hold on to, it seems like we're destined for this moment. And I added this to the line about Adam's body, or his self not fitting his body, is the idea here that Adam was not at one with his environment, and that this was the cause of technological manipulation. Is the implication that our souls no longer match our bodies after the fall? Did Adam's self fit him before the fall? And if so, why did he fall if initially congruous? I'm not exactly sure what to make of that line. If Adam had been perfectly harmonious with his body in the Garden of Eden, would he ever have felt the need to engage in the gnosis to manipulate matter? We're obviously, I am extracting from the story to understand what Auden is saying here. Is the incongruity between oneself and body something that happens after the fall? It's a bit of a chicken and the egg question, but I found that to be an interesting point that he's making.
Yeah, and it completely overlays with, if we want to take on the framework of atoms and the electron shell and how they operate, and how something that's unstable is going to seek stabilization by interacting with the environment around it, which is what a chemical reaction supposedly is. I think that's a fun concept to think about here too.
Definitely. Okay, let's go to slide 6. Here we have our trio from the Apollo 11, Michael Collins, Buzz Aldrin, and Neil Armstrong, quarantined. This is all very interesting. They're quarantined, I believe, in airline streamer after they returned from Earth to not spread space flu or something like that, which is interesting. Is the idea of a space pandemic is also in 2001: A Space Odyssey. Apollo, if individuals are not already aware of this, I know Jordan is. Apollo is also, among being a god of many things, the sun, music, but he's also the god of plagues, and he's also the god of medicine. He can also heal you from the plague he brings. So the fact that quarantine and pandemics is sort of baked into the Apollo missions kind of makes sense, from a synchronistic perspective. And yeah, here is Nixon giving the okay hand sign to Buzz in the Hornet +3. I believe they were picked up by the USS Hornet, so they called it the Hornet +3. So is Auden pointing out, I'm going to read the stanza. Homer's heroes were certainly no braver than our trio, but more fortunate Hector was excused the insult of having his valor covered by television. I thought this is a strange stanza. Is Auden pointing out the mythological nature of the moon landing? Why would he analogize the trio with historical and mythological composites? Like, we don't really know. Like, there's a lot of debate about whether or not the Trojan War was real, if Homer was real. And he's saying, Homer's heroes are certainly no braver than our trio. It's kind of like a little tongue in cheek there. What is he saying? And just to refresh our memory on who Hector was. In Greek mythology, this is from Wiki, Hector is a Trojan prince, a hero and the greatest warrior for Troy during the Trojan War. He's a major character in Homer's Iliad, where he leads the Trojans and their allies in the defense of Troy, killing countless Greek warriors. He is ultimately killed in single combat by the Greek hero Achilles, who later drags his dead body around the city of Troy behind his chariot. So this line about Hector's valor covered by television, it doesn't really make sense. Why would it be an insult to have Hector's valor covered by television? What is it that is so insulting about television? Did television demystify the heroes of the moon landing? Was their achievement somehow denigrated by the presence of television cameras? Could it have something to do with Hector's body being dragged after his death? Our own moon heroes, a defeated enemy, participants on the side that accepted the horse, and their downfall is captured on film for all to see. I think these are very interesting questions that I'm not sure Auden ever elaborated on. He could be simply saying that television just made the whole thing very boring. And so, unlike Homer's communication of Hector, where he was doing all these brave things and the repelling of the Greeks, television made the moon landing very technocratic. It made it, really dull. It really made the whole idea of looking at the moon for many of us very dull. I remember years ago, someone would always text me and say, "Look at the moon." I'm like, "Why would I do that? It's just a dusty rock in the sky, But now that I see the moon differently, I'm never like that. I'm always one of the first ones to point it out. Or is there something else going on here? Hector dies and is like we saw there, his body is paraded as kind of a spoil of war, or as like kind of a warning. And our astronauts were given parades and covered widely by television. So what's happening here? You ready to go to the next one?
Yeah, I think so.
You're like, look, we gotta speed this up.
It's good, but I don't have anything to add.
All right. So this next slide, not many people know that comprehensive practice for the moon landings happened in the Nevada desert, and that's where this photo is from. I believe they're doing some geological samples here. And Auden writes, "Worth going to see, I can well believe it. We're seeing, nah. I once rode through a desert and was not charmed. Give me a watered, lively garden, remote from blatherers." So this is actually, this worth going to see, I can well believe it. We're seeing, nah. This is actually an inverted line from Samuel Johnson's travel diary from when he went to Ireland. This man named Boswell, I don't have a great background on this, said, "Should you not like to see Dublin, sir?" Johnson, "No, sir. Dublin is only the worst capital." Boswell, "Is not the Giant's Causeway worth seeing?" Johnson, "We're seeing, yes, but not worth going to see." So this is from Boswell's Life of Johnson. I thought that was interesting, flipping it like that.
Mm-hmm.
That, I guess the implication here is that the moon, as we're told by television cameras and the astronauts, is not worth going to see. It's desolate. I believe Buzz Aldrin said it was called, he said it was beautiful desolation or something like that. And so Auden was thoroughly unimpressed with that. But the whole idea of getting there really intrigued him, whereas Sam Johnson did not care for Ireland, but he definitely thought the Giant's Causeway was super interesting. And perhaps there's a message here, bringing our attention to the Giant Causeway. The Giant Causeway does not seem to be an air quotes natural formation. I'm not some sort of geologist, so I couldn't tell you exactly why these hexagonal columns seem to erupt out of the ground, but it does not look natural as I understand it. So that opens up a real can of worms, though. Um, so in this desert, Auden identifies the moon as a desert, which, like I said earlier, they uh, they knew this, that the moon was a desert, through various probes. They weren't exactly sure prior to landing on the moon what the surface was going to be like, but thankfully they did their due diligence and sent advanced probes and found out, wouldn't you know, that the surface was not unlike many places on Earth. So, it's great because then they got to practice in Nevada and Antarctica and stuff like that. And just the whole thing came together so well. Let's see. But that's what I have to say there. You want to say anything else?
I just think there's a potential kind of Garden of Eden illusion here, calling back to Adam. That seems to be a theme
Oh,
throughout the
yes.
poem.
Yes.
Yep. I think it's funny how he says remote from blatherers, because you would think that on the moon there wouldn't be blathering, presumably. There's no one there, unless
Yeah, I think it's going to feed into the next stanza, which
totally.
let's just go to
Yeah,
that.
let's do it.
Uh, I think he's so nauseated with the constant talk of the day. And just to read this about the Von Brauns and their ilk, where on August mornings I can count the morning glories, where to die has a meaning and no engine can shift my perspective. Uh, so this slide here, for many years I thought this was a deep fake, but this is Von Braun, one of Von Braun, appearing to walk in front of the Apollo 11 moonlander, and it's actually a real photo. I found its source from the Jackson Daily Journal. It was published on September 30th, 1969. So just 2 months after landing on the moon, they had a complete replica of the Apollo 11 landing in Atlanta. And the caption of this says, Dr. Wernher von Braun, one of the leaders in America's spaceflight program, took a walk on the moon. Dr. von Braun strolled through an exact replica of the Apollo 11 moon landing mission after officially opening the exhibition at Atlanta's Southeastern Fair. So we had this fair giving people a good sense of what it was like to walk on the moon.
Thank goodness.
Yep. We're just, we got it. We got there, confirmed, and we had the exhibit ready to go. So this line about Von Braun and their ilk, there might be layers to what Auden is referring to in regards to their ilk. This could be just the NASA rocket engineers. He's tired of all the computations and calculations deadening the poetic majesty of the moon. Or this might be a reference to the Nazis who brought over via Project Paperclip to work on their rocket program. This is a pretty well-established fact at the time. At this moment in time, I think it was pretty well known that von Braun was a rocket scientist for hire, and he carried the Nazi stigma amongst those paying attention. Although I do not know if Auden specifically was pointing this out. At the very least, Auden seems to be pointing out that this whole moon landing endeavor is trying to alter our whole perception of reality, where nothing really matters anymore. It is robbing existence and death of its meaning. Why is that? Is it because the yearning to launch into the void is a desire for nothingness itself? And I also thought the choice to mention morning glories is interesting. There's a rich symbolic tradition associated with the flower, many of which see it as a symbol of unrequited love. Auden, being a reticent Christian, may have preferred an interpretation from the Christian tradition. And quoting from flowermeaning.com, Christians believe that the morning glory related directly to the finite nature of life on earth, each single flower representing one life, and life being represented by the daylight hours of the sun, withering and finally dying by nightfall. So The message here could be that the idea of space travel takes man out of the rhythmic and meaningful cycles of Earth that appropriately situate us into faith frameworks such as Christianity.
What color is a
What
morning
do you think,
glory?
Jordan? Ooh, I think they're purple, maybe. Yeah, they're purple, but they kind of have like, yeah, there's a lot more there, but they kind of have like a starburst at the center of them.
Ooh. Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to kind of have a mental image because I feel like visually there might be some symbolism there as
I
well.
should have, there is. I should have
That's
brought
okay.
that in there. That's a good point. I'll make a note of that
Cool.
for, yeah. Yeah. Anything else?
I like this line, no engine can shift my perspective. Like no amount of calculations, no amount of like scientific application, no amount of machinery. I don't know, all of these very industrial mechanisms uh, are irrelevant to Auden's poetic mind.
Right. Yeah. I think you appreciate that as being a individualist.
Sure. Yeah.
All right. Let's go to slide 9. This is the famous moon print photo, the footprint photo. Unsmudged, thank God, my moon still queens the heavens as she ebbs and falls a presence to glop at. Her old man, made of grit, not protein, still visits my Austrian several. So, unsmudged is an interesting word choice for Auden. Auden may think that from his perspective, he cannot see how the astronauts have trashed his beloved heavenly body by trouncing around on it. You know, you can't see those moon footprints from Earth. Um, I think the explanation for that, even with high-powered telescopes, I think the idea is that they're not really visible anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. It may be an open question to whether Auden actually believed the moon to be smudged at all by the event in question. And as for the Queen's the Heavens remarks, this is likely a biblical reference that is generally at odds with the Christian message. In Jeremiah 7:18, the King James Version, it reads, "The children gather wood and the fathers kindle the fire, and the women knead their dough to make cakes to the Queen of Heaven and to pour out drink offerings unto other gods, that they may provoke me to anger." Ellicott's commentary for English readers wrote this: "The Queen of Heaven, the goddess thus described, was a kind of Assyrian Artemis, identified with the moon and connected with the symbolic worship of the reproductive powers of nature. Its ritual probably resembled that of the Babylonian Aphrodite, Mylitta, the mother goddess, in its impurities, and thus provoked the burning indignation of the prophet here and in Jeremiah 44:19, as well as 44:25. So we keep this idea of worshiping the Queen of Heaven is something that just keeps coming up in human history over and over and over again. It's like, why? The word glop uh, is an archaic word. It just means to stare in amazement, so you can use that. And her old man is a reference to the man in the moon, made of grit, not protein. And it's interesting how I don't think a lot of people know this, but interesting how the man in the moon myth involves a cursed individual, and how interesting that we celebrate our own moon myth. A longstanding, this is from Wiki, a longstanding European tradition holds that the man was banished to the moon for some crime. Jewish lore says that the image of Jacob is engraved on the moon. Another held that he is the man caught gathering sticks on the Sabbath and sentenced by God to death by stoning in the book of Numbers 15:32 through 36. Some Germanic cultures thought he was a woodcutter found working on the Sabbath, and there's a Roman legend that he is a sheep thief. One medieval tradition claims that he is Cain, the wanderer forever doomed to circle the earth, which is referred to in Dante's Inferno. For now doth Cain with fork of thorns confine, on either hemisphere touching the wave, beneath the towers of Seville, yesternight the moon was round. So that's what I have for that. It's going to feed into the next slide.
Sure.
Do you want to keep going, or do you want to add some commentary here? We have 2 slides left, so
Yeah.
I think if we can finish in 10 minutes, we'll be good.
Cool. I don't know what to make of it, but the grit not protein is very interesting. Like, are these personas like distinct from us as humans? Like, what? I don't know. I don't really know how to interpret it, but it's an interesting line to me.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I mean, I think the grit is primarily just referring to the detritus in the sand and whatnot that is supposedly part of the moon. But the grit focuses. You could really say so much more here. Grit has another meaning, right? Like, we typically talk about grit as something that is more substantive. When you say somebody's got grit, right, it's enduring. Whereas you talk about something being made of protein, that's going to be subject to decay, right? Just like a decaying animal. Whereas the man of grit, the man in the moon, that will outlast these men of protein. I think that might be something that he's saying.
That's interesting.
I think that's right. I overlooked that when I was putting this together. Should we go to the next one?
Yeah.
All right. Our penultimate slide. With his old detachment and the old warnings still have power to scare me, hybris comes to an ugly finish. Irreverence is a greater oath than superstition. So the photo that I chose here is Alan Shepard driving his golf ball on the moon. This is during Apollo 14. So the reason why I chose that is that frequently the man on the moon is represented as this man carrying a bundle of sticks. And if you look into the origins of golf, it's likely that it originated from either like a shepherd tending his sheep, or possibly the story of Tubal-Cain. That's a whole thing I'm not prepared to get into right now, but I see this pattern symbolism with the man on the moon drawing and Alan Shepard hitting the golf ball. So that's why I chose that. There were some words here that I think I need some clarity on. The word hybris I had never heard before, but in British English, that just means hubris. And that could be pride or arrogance, but specifically in regards to Greek tragedy, an excess of ambition, pride, ultimately causing the transgressor's ruin. So Auden appears to be warning that this Greek tragic comedy that is the moon landing will eventually prove disastrous, I think, by that word choice. And what else did I want to say here? And it does appear that Auden is familiar with that the man in the moon folklore involves the man being condemned, and why he might be scared and is heeding the warning of the man in the moon to not do the things that imprisoned him there. Right. Irreverence is a greater oath than superstition. I think that's a great line as well.
I do too.
Pride before the fall. Not heeding the warnings of the past, thinking that it's just a silly myth, that the same thing won't happen to you. And finally, our apparatniks will continue making the usual squalid mess called history. All we can pray for is that the artists, chefs, and saints may still appear to blithe it. This is a picture of the old mission control that they used for the Apollo missions. I believe this is from Gemini, actually, if I'm being
I've been
accurate.
Here.
I know.
Yeah.
We've got these old clunky computers, look like they're playing Pong, and the projector screens and whatnot. It's interesting. So what does apparatniks mean? This appears to be a made-up word that at least takes apparatchik as its reference point. I may be saying that incorrectly, but I knew that this is an interesting word. It's connected to communism. Apparatic,
Well, sounds
apparatchik.
like Sputnik. It has some.
Ooh, that's I hadn't. Yeah, I think you might be right. He's probably this word in Sputnik. There we go. There we go. I'm gonna just. All right, I gotta make a note of that. Good. I like that a lot. Um, See, that would have been most obvious to me if I was born around this time and had grown up hearing about Sputnik all the time, but I just didn't think to associate it. So, some synonyms of apparatchik is a member of a communist apparat, or it means a blindly devoted official, follower, or member of an organization such as a corporation or political party. I think this is Auden's word for those who are blindly devoted to technological conquests, which Sputnik is emblematic of as well. So I think that was a fantastic observation of yours, Jordan. And blithe typically means that you're lacking due thought or consideration. It's just casual heedlessness. You're generally happy. You're not giving the appropriate reverence that everyone else says you should. And given the tone of Autumn's poem, he seems to be advocating for the aforementioned groups treat the whole moon landing affair with disinterestedness and go on with their meaningful activities as if Apollo 11 never happened. So artists keep making their art, chefs keep making delectable gastronomic experiments, and saints continue to propitiate the divine. So that is Auden's moon landing poem and what I have to offer. Jordan, do you want to say anything in closing?
So many themes here. The end is quite interesting. I think there's this whole authoritarianism versus individualism theme throughout it that we could like go back and reread more directly. I appreciate this perspective that yeah, it Auden seems like an outsider looking at it for sure, rather than someone who's like in this movie himself. Um, but yeah, I think I'm grateful for all those who are the chefs and the saints and the artists, people who are seeing things with their own lens, and we all have different lenses. Uh, and just watching this show that is the mythology that seems to be unfolding before us.
Well, thank you for doing this today with me.
Of
My
course.
computer is about to die, so we probably should bring it to an end.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.